It's chapter 16, and things start off weird, get good, and end up really bad. Let's figure out why. Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. From the start of the chapter, Kathy tells us that no one talks to anybody else back at the cottages about the Norfolk trip. As she observes, even among ourselves, we avoided talking about the trip. This is quite strange for a journey that spanned 3 chapters, nearly 15% of the overall novel. Kathy offers some theories as to why this might be, but I think the first paragraph not reflecting on the trip holds the key. Listen to this on 185. As spring came on, there seemed to be more and more veterans leaving to start their training. And though they left without fuss in the usual way, the increased numbers made them impossible to ignore. I'm not sure what our feelings were witnessing these departures. I suppose to some extent we envied the people leaving. It did feel like they were headed for a bigger, more exciting world. But of course, without a doubt, their going made us increasingly uneasy. What strikes me about this description is that they left without fuss. And when you think about it, going toward training is also going toward donations and toward death. So why are they going toward this fate without fuss? One possibility is that when it comes to death, the person doing the dying usually doesn't make much of a fuss about it. This certainly isn't true for all situations. But sometimes even individuals in extreme pain find serenity as they approach the bourne of that undiscovered country. Whether this comes from making peace or going numb at the end is anybody's guess, but most of the fuss, when it comes to dying, is left to the grieving survivors. But I don't think this acceptance of grief is actually happening here in the novel. Many members of the cottages are in the denial stage, clinging to rumors of deferrals from other residences. Additionally, when Alice and Gordon leave, Kathy notes they'd both asked to start their training and went off with cheerful smiles. So this doesn't sound like people going toward death. It sounds like people heading toward a milestone. It's like when I hear seniors in high school anxiously await graduation. Just wish that they could speed up time a little bit. And that's understandable. It's a feeling that is natural to have at that moment. They're ready to move on. But that desire to move on from childhood isn't any different for us as it is for the characters in this novel. Their lives are just compressed compared to our own. In the next section of the chapter, Tommy very nervously volunteers his drawings to Kathy. Kathy is, of course, the first person Tommy tells about his drawings, and other than Ruth, no one else has seen them. As much as he tries to be nonchalant, he obviously cares what Kathy thinks of them. And even though she recognizes this, Kathy struggles to come right out and praise them. Not because they're bad, but because they're something so different from anything she's used to seeing, especially from Tommy. But listening to her description of them, I'm reminded of what we heard Tommy talk about Miss Emily saying about art in the previous chapter, that it reveals our souls. And traces of Tommy's soul emerge from these drawings. His protective nature can be seen in the way he's considered how they'd protect themselves or be able to reach and fetch things. You can also tell how important this is to him by the amount of detail he's included. Kathy describes them. The first impression was like one you'd get if you took the back off a radio set. Tiny canals, weaving tendons, miniature screws, and wheels were all drawn with obvious precision. To me, they sound like the sort of foundational work of a future animator or game designer or children's book illustrator. But of course, Tommy doesn't get to follow his dreams. At least not in the way many of us get to. The final section of the novel starts with Kathy finding a new, irritating trait in Ruth. This time, whenever Kathy brings up a funny memory about Hailsham, Ruth pretends to not know what she's talking about. At first, this seemed like such a weird fight to have, but as this novel often does, it got me thinking about the everyday in a more intentional way. In this instance, how there has to be a sort of agreement when people reminisce. It's a display of affection toward how things were, to your past selves even. And if someone doesn't agree to venture into these past memories, it can delegitimize them and make the person in Kathy's position feel childish and embarrassed. All of this is, of course, very subtle in the novel, but picking up on subtleties is kind of Kathy's thing. But Ruth is also good at picking up on things, and as her and Kathy are having a particularly good spell, Ruth is helping Kathy through the end of a relationship with a guy named Lenny who just left to start his training. She finds Kathy's Never Let Me Go cassette, the one Kathy hasn't told her about yet. And Kathy tries to play it cool, but the fact that Tommy got the cassette for her and neither of them told Ruth about it could be taken as crossing a bit of a line. But they go on laughing at poor Lenny until the conversation takes a turn. Kathy tells us on 192, "I wasn't being as careful as I might have been, because before long, we drifted from laughing about Lenny to laughing about Tommy. At first it all felt good-natured enough, like we were just being affectionate towards him, but then we were laughing about his animals." Obviously, this is horrendous. Tommy's bullying started because of his artwork, and he's finally gotten the courage and incentive to start drawing, and here the only two people he's confided in, his girlfriend and his best friend, mock him behind his back. A few days later, Kathy discovers the ramifications of this conversation in a small, abandoned church graveyard, a very interesting setting for what happens here. She stumbles upon Ruth, disclosing her true feelings about the drawings to Tommy. Ruth uses this opportunity to drive a wedge between Tommy and Kathy, and the plan works with lethal precision. She discloses that both her and Kathy laughed at and mocked his drawings. Kathy is left so stunned that she goes numb to it all. Here's her description of the events on 195. "I've thought about those moments over and over. I should have found something to say. I could have just denied it, though Tommy probably wouldn't have believed me. And to try to explain the thing truthfully would have been too complicated. But I could have done something. I could have challenged Ruth, told her she was twisting things, that even if I might have laughed, it wasn't in the way she was implying. I could even have gone up to Tommy and hugged him, right there in front of Ruth. That was something that came to me years later, and probably wasn't a real option at the time given the person I was and the way the three of us were with each other. But that might have done it, where words would only have gotten us in deeper. But I didn't say or do anything. It was partly, I suppose, that I was so floored by the fact that Ruth would come out with such a trick. I remember a huge tiredness coming over me, a kind of lethargy in the face of the tangled mess before me. It was like being given a maths problem when your brain's exhausted and you know there's some far-off solution, but you can't work up the energy even to give it a go. Something in me just gave up. A voice went, "All right, let him think the absolute worst. Let him think it. Let him think it." And I suppose I looked at him with resignation, with a face that said, "Yes, it's true. What else did you expect?" And I can recall now, as fresh as anything, Tommy's own face, the anger receding for the moment, being replaced by an expression almost of wonder, like I was a rare butterfly he'd come across on a fence post. In the end, Kathy leaves them in the graveyard, attempting to cut her losses rather than make peace with either of them. But as she said earlier in the chapter, about the conversation with Ruth about Tommy's animals in front of him, it felt bad enough at the time, but I had no idea in the churchyard that day how far-reaching the repercussions would be. And as you continue into the final bit of this novel, I think you'll see what she means by that. See you then.